When we do an inventory of the Christian life, it must be a personal thing between us and God as to how we see our actions and our ministries. Good morning. This is Pastor Ernie Lewis of the Blue Point Church in Sisney, Illinois, with your thoughts for Wednesday. Paul in Galatians chapter 6 is writing about our responsibilities that we have toward each other. In this passage, he calls for us to bear one another's burdens. And while he admonishes us to restore one who's been caught by a transgression, he also tells us to keep watch on ourselves, lest we should also be tempted. He warns us about thinking too highly of ourselves, but instead he says we should take a personal inventory. So in Galatians chapter 6 and verse 4, Paul says, "Let each one test his own work, and then his reason to boast will be in himself alone and not in his neighbor. For each will have to bear his own load." When we're called to test our own work, it seems that we become fruit inspectors. We are to consider what kind of fruit we produced in the Lord's work through our lives and through our ministry around others. And when we test our own work, we have to consider whether what we're doing is lasting in the scheme of things in this world or even in the world to come. Paul describes this in 1 Corinthians chapter 3 by saying that some people's works look like wood and hay and stubble, which when it's tested, it'll be burned up with fire and actually found to be useless. Instead, he said, we should be producing such good works that are compared to gold and silver and precious stones that are lasting and determined to be of great value. He points out if anyone's work endures these tests, he will receive a reward. So we need to test our own work to see if we're doing things that are lasting, if we're investing in things and people that are important in the kingdom of the Lord. We also have to consider our motivation for our work. Is it to be God honoring? And finally, he says, if we're doing those things that are pleasing to God and working with a heart that is submitted to his Spirit, we will have reason to boast within ourselves and not depending on the work of our neighbor. His point is that each one will have to bear his own load. So while we are called to bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ, we must also look into our own lives and our hearts to make sure that we are carrying our load. So what do we see when we're called to examine our own work? Do we find things there that are working, that are producing gold and silver and precious stones? Or would our work and ministry for the Lord be pictured as wood and hay and stubble? It's easy to see this time of year what it looks like, those worthless things that are left in the field after the harvest that could easily be burned up. So let's examine our work to be more prosperous for the Lord and his ministry.